بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد وبارك وسلم. Today Imam Ghazālī speaks about, rahimahullah, he speaks about the benefits or the harms of isolation. Ibn Aṭā'illah, he writes in his Hikam that nothing benefits like isolation. By it, a person enters into the field of contemplation. He said, Maydān fikrah, enters into the field or the Maydān of fikrah. What he's saying is that when a person isolates himself, one of the benefits of it is that when you're isolated from the dunya, when you're isolated from family, friends, and acquaintances, then what you're left with is yourself. You're left with your mind. And that naturally leads towards contemplation. Something that we don't get a lot of nowadays. Nowadays, with cell phones especially, as soon as we wake up in the morning, what do? We pick up our phone, we get caught up on our messages, and then we get to work, and the entire day is spent. Even though you may be sitting alone, you're really not alone anymore as long as you have an electronic device with you. So then this opportunity that the people prior used to have of contemplation is lost now. Right? We saw that the Anbiya, all of them did shepherding. We saw that people used to spend extended periods of time by themselves. They're out traveling. Now we can go from one place to another in a matter of minutes, hours. Before, the same would take days. In those times, what would you do? You would sit with yourself and you would contemplate. You would look at the sama, you would look at the dunya, you would contemplate on it. You would think about your place. What is it that you're doing with your life? And you would contemplate. You would look at the situations of other people and you would contemplate. We don't have that anymore. I noticed even on my plane, it's a 14-hour plane flight. But they make sure that you don't get bored. Free Wi-Fi, there's a screen in front of you. There's so much to do now. Whereas this would have been a beautiful 14 hours of contemplation, a fikrah. It doesn't happen anymore. So this is something that we have to be cognizant of, that due to the nature of our existence now, that we have lost out on something that is tremendously important. And this may be the reason, wallahu a'lam, or one of the reasons, that the youth of today, or say the adults of yesterday, are the youth of today. Meaning, by the time you were 16 years old, 17 years old, you were an adult. You had a job, you had a family, you had all of these things going on. You thought like an adult, you interacted like an adult. Now, if you're 16 years old, we don't even we just say, okay, here's your license to drive. And that's it. You can't even vote for president yet. So one of the reasons for this may be the fact that we don't even let anyone think anymore, such that they can develop intellectually, mature emotionally, so that they can get to the point of actually doing proper contemplation. So it's something that's become foreign to us. So one of the benefits that Imam Ghazālī quotes Ibn Aṭā'illah as saying is that a person spends isolation, they have time by themselves. Now there is a very famous Ikhtilāf, disagreement among the ulama as to whether or not it's better for a person to isolate themselves or to be among the public. And so there's a back and forth when we look at the discussion that takes place for that. So for example, among the Salaf, we see great scholars like Sufyan al-Thawri, Ibrahim Adham, Ibn Adham, Dawud al-Ta'i, Ibn Iyad, and others who preferred isolation. So in this debate of is it better to be among people or is it better to be by yourself, these individuals from the Salaf said it is better to be by yourself. And then we saw others who said no, it's mustahab, it's better that you spend your time with the public. And so among these people are people like Sa'id ibn Musayyib, al-Sha'bi, Ibn Urwa, and others, Imam Shafi'i himself, Ibn Mubarak, Imam Ahmad, who preferred this particular opinion, that a person should not isolate themselves. Now Imam Ghazālī goes in this back and forth discussion about the proofs on both sides, but we'll see at the end that you don't necessarily have to pick one or the other. So continue on the discussion of so let's do that little back and forth as to benefits of both sides. So as far as the benefit of being by yourself and being in isolation, is that a person doesn't come to depend upon people. When you're among people, it's very easy to say, hey, can you help me? You can't do something, you forgot something, so you say to the other person, hey, can you do this for me? That's beneficial in some extent, but on another hand, it's also harmful in that it doesn't allow you to have to do it yourself. When a person is isolated, they don't have anyone to turn to or depend upon, then what happens is that they will naturally come to the conclusion, I can't do it, no one else around me is there to do it, let me place my trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Naturally, that should have been the first place you went to. But the fact is, most of us don't. We look for the asbab, we look for the causes and the means around us, and we attach ourselves to that. But when a person has no one around them, then in that situation, they will attach themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by natural experience, they'll come to realize that I was in this difficult situation, there was no one there to help me. I placed my trust in Allah, and my situation became resolved, or my situation turned out for the better. And by personal experience and time, that relationship between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala develops. But if they always have someone to depend upon, let me ask my dad, he'll take care of it. I got a rich uncle, a rich friend, he'll take care of it. And you go and they take care of it. Then that trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never really has a chance to develop practically, but just becomes something theoretical. Right? Stop any Muslim. Who should we trust first? Everyone will say Allah. There's no question. Practically, is that what you do? When there's a time of need, practically, do you call up your father? Or do you turn to Allah first? You have somebody who's smart, capable, rich, whatever it is, do you call them first? Or do you call upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first? So one of the harms of being among people is that you become attached to them, and you start looking to them for khair, rather than looking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then you forget, there's these two words. One is sabab, which is the cause, and then a musabbib, the causer. So sabab is the cause in front of you. The musabbib is the one who created that cause, who brought it into existence, who facilitates it. So for example, you need to cook something, you have fire. Fire is the sabab, the cause by which you cook. But the creator of the fire, the cause of that cause, the musabbib is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When a person gets used to the world of means and sees everything as the cause in front of them that they can utilize, they will forget the actual musabbib, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the actual cause behind all of that. And another big harm that Imam Ghazālī mentions is that naturally, when you see that someone can benefit you, you will begin to flatter that person more. You will begin to treat that person perhaps better because you need something from them. Right? You have two people, you treat both of them well. It's not that you treat one bad and the other one worse. But if you know that one of them can benefit you, or has benefited you and can benefit you in the future, then naturally, without even thinking, you will likely start to treat that person better. You will flatter them. You will be kinder to them. You will give them things that you may not have given otherwise. And so this creates a certain hypocrisy in an individual. That instead of my attention being to Allah, it's Him. Or instead of my treating this person well for the sake of Allah, I am now treating him well because for my own sake. There's something I want from him. Again, oftentimes this isn't even conscious. It's something unconscious that you end up doing to benefit that person. You'll oftentimes find that shuyukh to their teacher, to the students, or teachers to their students, that there may be a student that they like, and they're actually more harsh on that student. They're a little bit more difficult on that student. And the student may think, my teacher doesn't like me. He's always criticizing me. He's always calling me out. But the fact is that there is a certain attachment there. There's love there. He wants to benefit, and so he's a little bit more difficult on that person. And it's to break this idea of like flattery. is to break this idea that, the one who comes and treats me nice, the one who comes and, whatever, brings the apple to the teacher, as the metaphor goes, that this is the person who gets treated well, versus the one who doesn't flatter, who doesn't do anything special, that person may get treated worse, not because he dislikes him, but because he sees that there's benefit in this person. He's not out to benefit him. I don't know if that makes sense, but inshallah it does. And so Ibn Ata'illah also mentions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at times gives difficulty to people so that person doesn't find ease. Right? So hear him out. He says that Allah only gives difficulty to them so that they don't find ease. He wants to turn them away from everything until they're only turning towards Him. I gave this example before of a person who comes before a king. And the ulama give this example of a person in need. He comes before the king, and no sooner does he come before the king and mentions his need that the king says, "Here's what you want, go." Gives it to him instantly. Go. And then another person comes along, and he comes before the king and says, "Here's my need." And the king says, "Not right now. Go to the side. Come back tomorrow." So then he comes back again, and the king says, No, just wait here for a while. Not right now." And this continues. And so the outsider, or perhaps the person themselves, may look at this and think, the king doesn't like me. He likes these other people. He comes, he gives them whatever they want. But me, he doesn't. He keeps putting me off, keeps putting me on hold. And so the ulama give this example that at times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala treats people this way. The ones He doesn't care to have in His presence, He gives them what they want. Because that's what they're there for. They want to fulfill their need, Allah gives it to them, and they're gone. The one that Allah really wants in His presence, He doesn't give it to them right away. Because if He were to, that person likewise would take it and run off. But Allah wants to retain that person in His presence. He wants you to come back and make dua again and again and again. So you make dua, you see sometimes somebody needs something, he makes dua, that person gets it immediately and they're gone. They won't present themselves before Allah again because they got what they wanted. Whereas the one who wanted something, Allah doesn't give it to him right away. So that he makes dua after the next salah, and after the next, and the next day, and the next week, and the next month, constantly bringing himself before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to ask. Allah likes His presence. It's a difference. We may look at it as something that we don't want, or Allah isn't pleased with us, but the fact is that Allah is pleased with us, and He's not pleased with the one who wants the dunya. So He gives him the dunya because Allah doesn't value that at all. He says, "Here, take it, go. You want a nice car? Fine. You want a nice house? Fine. Take it, go." But the one that Allah truly loves, no, I want you to come back to me. Come back and ask. Make dua. Seek out the pious people. Because when you do that, then you become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So oftentimes you find that those people who are most closest to Allah are those in the most difficulty. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, it may be a tremendously beneficial thing. Whereas those who are furthest from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are those who get whatever they want immediately. So there are times, and I'll mention this as a personal thing, that there are times that if I get something too easily, I'm worried. I'm worried. I still have shukr. I'm still very grateful, still have shukr to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but I'm worried that perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave it to me too easily because He doesn't really want me there. So then the proper response in that situation is, even after you receive something, present yourself before Allah again. You got what you wanted? You made your dua, you did your istikhara, you gave some sadaqah, you did all of this, and you got what you wanted. Then the proper response to that should be to continue those actions. continue the du'as, continue the extra nawafil, continue the sadaqat, so that you don't become one of those people that as soon as they receive what they wanted, they disappeared from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Ibn Atha'illah says something similar. He says that at times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives difficulty to you continuously so that you turn away from everything until nothing pulls you away from Allah. Meaning you turn away from everything other than Allah until you're only turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for everything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ تَفَرَّقُوا وَاخْتَلَفُوا. That don't be among those people who differed, they separated and they differed. This ayah in Al Imran is proof that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so those scholars, as I mentioned, who said that it's better to stay among people, at times they will give this ayah as a proof. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, don't be like those people, تَفَرَّقُوا, they differed and they separated. Meaning, stay with people. فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I brought their hearts together. So these are proofs that people should come together. Now, those people who disagreed, who said no, that isolation is better, they respond back to these ayat and say that this means don't have hatred for people in your heart. It doesn't mean you have to come together, but it doesn't mean you have to come together. It means that if you're going to isolate and separate, don't do it because you dislike the other person. That's the wrong reason. So if you isolate yourself for the sake of Allah, that's beneficial. But if you isolate yourself from people because you dislike them, then that's harmful. If you find yourself disliking someone, then the response to that should not be, I hate this person, let me leave him. I'm better than this person, let me leave. That's where it ends eventually. But rather it's, let me make amends. Let me bring the hearts together again. The other person may have been right, the other person may have been wrong, I may have been right. But our coming together is more important than that as brothers and sisters. So let me forgive. Let me take the blame. But let us come back together so we are not like those كَالَّذِينَ تَفَرَّقُوا وَاخْتَلَفُوا. So we're not like those people. The Prophet ﷺ, he said that a believer is one who is loving and one who is loved. There is no goodness in the one who doesn't love, and nor is he loved. What's the indication here? Is that if you're going to come together, well, this is the only way, right? You have to love people, and they will reciprocate that back. And there's no good in the person who doesn't show love, nor is love shown to that person. So this hadith tells us that, or the people who argue against isolation, say that in this hadith we have through proof that the Prophet ﷺ is saying, love one another. How can you love one another if you're isolated from each other? What would be the response to those people who say isolation is better? You guys understand what I'm saying? They hear the Prophet ﷺ is saying that there's no khair, there's no goodness in the one who doesn't love people and isn't beloved by people. So those people who say that it's better to be among people take this hadith as proof. How can you love people if you're not with them? But then the group of people who say no, isolation is preferred, what would they say about this?
Love them from a distance.
Love them from a distance, yeah.
So you maintain that love even though you're individually separate.
Yeah. So the fact is that you can still love somebody and not be with them. So if you're going to isolate and separate, that doesn't necessitate that there's a lack of love. You can do both. You can isolate, separate yourself, but still not have any animosity towards other people as well. Likewise, there's the story of the Ashab al-Kahf, right? The people of the cave. Why did they separate themselves and go into the cave? You guys remember?
They were possibly persecuted by people
For
practicing Islam.
So they went into the cave to protect their Islam. right? They separated themselves for the sake of their iman. They saw that the people were going in one direction, and so they wanted to protect their iman, so they separated for that sake. So in the story of Kahf, we have proof that isolation is a path that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preferred, or liked in this group at least. Likewise, hijrah, right? The companions had first made hijrah towards Ethiopia, and then later towards Medina. Why didn't they just stay in Mecca and continue what they were doing? Continue to bring people together, or to get the kuffar to like them, or to continue their da'wah in Mecca. Why did they leave? Same answer. They left for the sake of their iman, to protect it. So, we're getting there, kind of with the back and forth, is to understand that there's benefits to both sides. That sometimes being among people is a way of benefiting the people. And sometimes leaving the people is also a way of benefit. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْعَبْدَ التَّقِي النَّقِي الْخَفِي. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the servant who is at-taqi, the one who is pious, an-naqi, the one who is pure. Here purity means outward and inward. So outward, wudu, ghusl, tahara, staying away from najasa and so on. And then inward, meaning keeping your heart pure from jealousy, hatred, and all of these other things, inshallah, Imam Ghazālī will speak about in the future. And then al-khafi, one who is hidden. A believer that's hidden. This is something that we speak about among like circles of students of Deen. Perhaps something that we don't speak enough about among other people, like average people, or perhaps those who are not don't have the time to be serious students of Deen. Is it better for us to be out and about? In fact, I was just having a conversation with a classmate of mine. He's a mufti, fairly popular. And the discussion we were having is, should he continue to travel? He travels all over the world. So should he continue to travel to do the work of da'wah and things that he does? And the conversation was about, what's the benefit in doing that? Does he have a responsibility to go and meet other people in different towns and different cities and give talks here and there? Or is it better for him to stay in his hometown and be relatively unknown? And so from this hadith we get this idea that the Prophet ﷺ is saying that the better person is al-khafi. The better slave of Allah is the one who keeps himself hidden. He's not trying to look for fame. He's not out to spread himself. Nowadays there's this idea, especially among speakers and da'is, that I am going to go out and become famous so that I can spread deen. I'm going to hype myself, I'm going to brand myself so that I can get the message of Islam out to everybody. In other words, I'm going to become famous, not for myself, but for the sake of deen. And it's a slippery slope. I think you guys can all kind of appreciate that very easily, that what kind of difficulty that can lead to. That on one hand, the shaitan or your nafs is telling you, become famous, become known wherever you go. On the other hand, it's saying, for the sake of deen. Whereas we look at the hadith, we don't see anything of the sort. We don't see the Prophet ﷺ attempting any sort of fame at all. We don't see the Sahaba doing this at all. We don't see the Salaf doing this at all. There doesn't seem to be any attempt of getting your name out. Any fame, shuhra that came along with it, came by accident. People came to know of this person. Right? We know what the Prophet ﷺ was like. When people from out of town would come and see him sitting among a group of people, they couldn't even tell which one was which. They wouldn't even know among this group that's sitting here of the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ, which one is the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet ﷺ had come closer to Medina Munawwara at the time of Hijrah, and Sayyidina Abu Bakr was with him, the people of Medina had a difficult time. They didn't quite know which one was which. until they came closer. So in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ is giving an indication that a person should be indifferent to the dunya. Whether I'm known or not unknown. Whether people see me in one way or don't see me in one way. Whether I'm among people or by myself, it's all the same to me. Any questions?
So, what I don't get in isolation, right? You were kind of forced to leave certain sunnahs like jama'ah and so on.
Right.
So, isn't that like very counterproductive?
So isolation does not mean going off in the jungle, right? That's what I'm going to get to it in the end, just sort of bring it together. But here, isolation does not mean that. So, no matter where you are, if there is a masjid close by, it's wajib on you, or at least sunnah mu'akkada, depending on the opinion, that you go to it. So a person can't be near a masjid and then decide to stay at home for the sake of isolation. That goes against the command of the Sharia. So here, the question is about istihbab. The question is about preference. What is better? Is it better to be isolated, or is it better to be among people? So when it comes to things like attending the jama'ah is not about istihbab, it's not about preference. It is a command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that men have to go to the masjid, that men should attend the jama'ah. So when we try to weigh the preference or the istihbab of isolation versus the wujub of the jama'ah, the wujub will win out. Here the question is otherwise, meaning not talking about those things that are necessary for men, so besides attending Salatul Jum'ah or the regular Jama'at, in those situations, should a person prefer to be among people, or should they prefer to be among by themselves? Just keep in mind right now, like I haven't chosen a side, right? I'm just kind of arguing back and forth here.
And would that mean that if a person were to imitate the Prophet ﷺ, the way he used to go in that cave and stay in isolation, would that be impermissible?
With the Prophet ﷺ being in isolation? What do you mean?
You know how like he was in the cave, like in isolation. So going up there, would that be impermissible?
So if the question is about if the Prophet ﷺ was in the cave of Ḥirā in the beginning of his nubuwah, where he used to isolate himself, you can argue both ways, right? One argument would be to say that the example of the Prophet ﷺ was to go into the cave. The other argument is that this is before nubuwah. So this is not, it doesn't fall under the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ after his prophethood, which is what we look at. If you're going to argue that he went to Ḥirā earlier, well, what did he do afterwards? Right? So you can't just randomly choose one and sort of ignore the rest of it. Now the question could also continue, that as a prophet, he has an obligation to be among the people. The rest of us are not prophets. We don't have the same obligation. Again, I'm not answering. I sort of just want to have this kind of back and forth so you guys understand the pros and cons of both. Any questions from the sisters? So it's a really good question. Is that on one hand we have an obligation to do da'wah and tabligh, of spreading the message of Islam. On the other side is the preference of isolation. So I'm going to jump the gun a little bit to answer your question. And that is, the purpose of isolation is to protect your iman. That is the purpose of isolation. Isolation itself is not the purpose. Isolation is a means of achieving a goal. The goal is the protection of your iman. That still holds. If a person cannot protect their iman and goes into the public, and by doing that they destroy their iman, then are they really benefiting the public? If a person falls into the trap of wanting fame and attention, and in the meantime they lose themselves and destroy their own Islam in the process, then are they really benefiting? They're not. They're harming people, in fact, by doing that. So this is something that's very tricky and very important. That on one hand, yes, your job is to spread Islam. On the other hand, your job is to spread it in a way that benefits people, and you cannot benefit people if you yourself have destroyed your own iman. And this is something very common. Like, I don't need to take examples today, that we have da'is and we have speakers that have lost themselves in their work. Their children suffer, their spouses suffer, and then eventually they fall into some sort of haram. And when they do, eventually people find out about it. And when that happens, whatever message that they had given, maybe decades worth of work, is lost, is gone. And in fact, the harm sometimes is irreparable, because those people that held on to you and saw you as the best example, all of a sudden see what you have become. And then when they see that, then that has a strong impact on their own iman. So to answer your question, you have an obligation both ways, but the obligation of proper da'wah cannot be done until a person's iman is protected. This is why sometimes you'll see people make a silly argument. They'll say that the Prophet ﷺ, he used to go in the early days of Islam, when he was in Makkah Mukarramah, he would visit the places where people were doing haram, right? So where there was idol worshipping taking place, he would go there and he would do da'wah to the people. So let me go into the clubs, let me go into the bars, let me go to the beaches and where all the haram is taking place, and I will fulfill the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. In the meantime, what is the person doing? He walks in, his eyes are looking at everything that is haram for him. His ears are hearing everything that is haram for him. He walked in perhaps with a good iman and he walked out with less than that. And then over time, what happens is that wears the person down. In the very beginning, the person may have been very solid on his deen. After a couple months or a few years of doing this, all of a sudden he'll start saying things, oh, you know what? Music's halal. Oh, it's okay if she's not covered, I can look at her as long as there's no desire. And so the deen starts to become watered down. Their iman starts to become watered down. And especially if they're students of deen, they will find reasons to make these arguments. And this is a very common occurrence. Does that mean that we can never walk into these spaces? It doesn't mean that either. It means that the only people that can walk into these spaces are those whose iman is strong enough to survive those spaces. How does a person know their iman is strong enough to survive those spaces? What do you guys think?
They don't.
So then that means no one can do it.
The person on top of them.
The person what?
The person on top of them, like shit.
Right, exactly. A person themselves you cannot rely upon yourself to know yourself well. You cannot rely upon yourself to say, I have no arrogance in me. Oftentimes that statement itself is a statement of arrogance. But rather, you need someone else to do that for you. So the way of the scholars, the way of the ulama has always been that you don't really go and do da'wah, you don't really go and teach until your elders or your teachers or those who are looking after you allow you to do it. And the second they tell you to stop, you stop dead in your tracks. You don't argue back and say, no, I'm okay, my iman's fine, oh, I don't have that arrogance in me. You don't argue. There is a person who's looking over you and you listen to that person. Take the example of a doctor. If one day the doctor might tell you, you need to exercise, go walk a mile every day. So what do? You go walk a mile every single day. Then you show up after a year perhaps and you're like, oh, you know what, I got chest pain. And the doctor's like, stop walking. Right now, just stop it. But you decide, you know what, no, doctor doesn't know what he's talking about, I'm going to go walk. You go walk, you have your heart attack and you die. So in the same way that we take our advice from those for our bodies, we take our advice for our iman as well for those who are above us. So you have somebody above you that when they say it's safe for your iman to do something, you do it. And when they say stop it, you stop it. And if there is no one to say that, then the path of caution is that you don't do it. You find that person, but if you don't have it, then you don't do it. Let's continue. So Imam Ghazālī mentions this statement. It's really profound. That a person in their body, meaning physically, they are with people. But their heart is with Allah alone. Shaykh Keller once said this years ago. I'm talking like, I might have heard it from him 15 years ago. And I found it profound, and so it's stuck in my head since then. He said that a person's isolation is above the shoulders. It's not about where they are physically. It's where their head's at. So a person can be in a crowded room of people, but be isolated. Meaning, in their mind, they could be alone or they could be with those crowds of people. In their mind, it's the same. Their mind is always attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here, he mentions something similar. That a person should be such that he is among people, but his heart is facing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Malik ibn Dinar, rahimahullah, he said, he too was from the Salaf, he said that whoever speaks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and it doesn't cause them to turn away from speaking to people, then his knowledge is little and his heart is blind and his years are wasted. So let me say that again. That whoever's speech or speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not cause them to turn away from speaking to others, then his knowledge is little, his heart is blind, and he has wasted his years. A person who's in conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is that person that whatever's happening, his attention is towards Allah. You know, we have sort of most people, I think almost everybody, has some sort of mental narrative that takes place all the time. Right? I'm walking down the street. I'm going to eat lunch now. It's time to pray. You know, you're not, hopefully, speaking this, because that would make you look weird. But there's this mental narrative that's kind of going on in your mind all of the time as to what you're doing, what you're thinking, what you're feeling. The awliya of Allah have something similar, but they're not talking to themselves, but rather they're talking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's this constant, like, you know, you have a friend with you, you're walking down the street, something happens, and what do? You mention it to the person next to you. Oh man, I'm really hungry. If that person wasn't there, you would just think it to yourself. Oh, my knee just started to hurt. What am I doing later today? What's on the schedule for tomorrow? Normally, if you're by yourself, you're thinking this. If there's somebody with you, you're mentioning it to them. The people who realize that they're always with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are having this conversation with Allah throughout the day. So what happens when the person gets used to that is that they no longer have a need to mention these sort of, what's the word for it? Just like basic things to the people who are around them. They'll mention it to Allah. So his point is that a person who doesn't speak to Allah in this way, that causes him to speak less to people, then his knowledge is little. Why is his knowledge little? Because he forgets that Allah is always with him. His heart is blind because it's disconnected from Allah. And his years are wasted because these are years wasted not being connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So some of the benefits of isolation, just further benefits, is one, that it prevents you from doing the haram. If you're not with people, you're not going to do ghibah. There's no one to do ghibah to. You're not going to mention stories about other people. You're not going to speak highly of yourself. There's no one there to speak highly. You're not going to do riyā, ostentation, because who are you going to show off to? There's no one there to show off to. So you're protected from these things. You stay silent most of the time. And in that silence, there's benefits. You tend to, a lot of bad habits that we have within us manifest because of us being among people. Hatred happens when there's someone to hate. Jealousy happens when there's someone to be jealous of. So if there's not people around you oftentimes, then these things are lessened by the very nature of the way you are. You're protected from a lot of fitan, a lot of fitnas, because that generally happens among people. Your deen is protected, and yourself is protected as well. And then you are protected from the evils of people. There are people who go around trying to harm people. They want to draw you into their evil. So you're protected from that as well. And you're protected of being covetous of what they have. But in mixing with people, there's benefit as well. For example, learning. How can you learn if you don't have someone to learn from or someone you sit with? How can you teach if you don't have people to teach? So from the benefits of being with people is knowledge. And beyond that, it's benefiting people. Right? As believers, we benefit people around us. Sometimes monetarily, sometimes by helping people. We take benefit from people. We gain reward oftentimes from having people around us. Like I just mentioned, as far as benefiting them, you gain reward by doing that. If you're not among people, you're going to miss out on a lot of that reward. People have rights over you. Your parents, your siblings, your children, your neighbor, your friends, your classmates, they have rights over you. And if you're not with them, you can't fulfill those rights. The very act, the good traits of the heart, for example, humility. Humility, a lot of it can't be manifested if you're not around people. It's never tested. Arrogance is tested when you're around people. Humility is manifested, proven by being around people. And so there's benefit in that as well. There's a benefit in gaining experience. And experience oftentimes just happens from being around people in different situations that they present. But he also mentions something really important. That isolation is for people that have knowledge. Isolation is for people that have knowledge. Meaning you need to gain knowledge first before you isolate yourself. What happens if you isolate yourself without knowledge? Okay.
You don't know what to do, I guess.
That's one thing, absolutely. Right? You're going to isolate. I'm going to isolate myself and do all this ibadat. Now you're alone, you're like, I don't know how to do anything.
You kind of just end up relying on your own intellect, basically.
Absolutely. You rely upon your own intellect, and oftentimes your intellect will lead you to do something that's wrong. Like Abu Bakr had mentioned, that a person in isolation who has no knowledge, he might think it's better for me to be isolated than to go for Jummah. And logically, a person can make that argument. As I just mentioned, all of the benefits of being isolated. He'll say, oh, I don't have to do any ghiba. I don't have to harm anyone. I get all these benefits. Let me not go to Jummah. When I go to Jummah, I might do ghiba. And this person logically might make sense. But it's a lack of knowledge that led them there. Also remember that when you're by yourself with your own thoughts, shaitan is still there too. So the whispers of shaitan are still there as well. So you need knowledge to be able to differentiate which one is which one is a good thought that Allah will be pleased with, and which one is a whisper of the shaitan, which will displease Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A person without knowledge may very well be following shaitan in everything that he does. And so he mentions, he said, thus he may fall into the situation where many of his states are a cause of laughter for the shaitan, while he considers himself to be of the worshippers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning all the while. So all the while he thinks, I'm an abid of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah is pleased with me, I'm getting so much ibadah done. In the meantime, shaitan is having a laugh at his expense because of his ignorance. So ilm, knowledge, is the asl of this deen. And let me throw a quick plug in for the Ghazālī Club. You guys are obviously here, so it's not really for you, but just as encouragement for you guys, that the purpose of these classes is purely, not purely, but one of the main purposes is knowledge. It's knowledge that you're not going to get anywhere else on campus. It's knowledge that you're not going to get elsewhere. It's so that you can come and learn about your deen, so that you can benefit yourself, know what situations are good and what situations are harmful. And the very basis of this deen, there is no religion that puts such an emphasis on knowledge as Islam does. You simply cannot do without it. Other religions, you may need to know a little bit, and then after that you can do whatever you want. Or you just follow the crowd. Or just, go and do a bunch of Hail Marys and you're set. In Islam, it doesn't work that way. You need, not that kind of Hail Mary, you need knowledge. And it's a fundamental aspect. You can't be a jahil and be a Muslim at the same time, be ignorant and be a Muslim at the same time. So now let's put this whole thing together. He says it's necessary for the person who separates himself that he sees his separation as preventing harm to the public. Meaning, he sees himself as the source of harm. You see yourself as a potential cause of fasad and fitna. So when you separate from people, you don't separate from them because they're worse than you. You separate from them because you're worse than they are. So the intent is, yes, as I mentioned, there's benefits that you are protected from some of their harms. But your actual intent should be that I contain more harm than they do. That I'm more aware of the harms within me. Let me save them from that by keeping myself away from them. If I'm with them, I may be the one who's going to do ghibah. If I'm with them, I may be the one that causes difficulty to them. So flip it around on yourself and protect them from you. But again, it's necessary that a person who does this have knowledge, they engage in proper practice, they have dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala constantly, they remember Allah, and they do fikr, meaning there's contemplation at the same time. That he remain constantly worried about or on the path of the akhirah. That he be engaged in, as I mentioned, awrad that we spoke about before, adhkar, in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That he be focused on the contemplation of Allah, who He is, His attributes, how He's manifested those attributes in this dunya. That he break himself from the dunya, meaning any sort of desire for it. That he be in contemplation of his death, about what his state will be like in the grave. One idea is this idea that isolation in this dunya is preparation for the grave. Isolating yourself in this dunya is preparation for the grave, where there is a forced isolation. A person who can't even isolate himself here, who can't remain in the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for 5 minutes, what's he going to do for the thousands of years that he'll be in the qabr by himself? How is he going to tolerate that? So one idea is this preparation of being alone is preparation for the qabr. One other benefit is that a person also stops fearing death from that as well. That when you've already kind of spent that time on your own, cut off from the dunya, not caring for it, then death itself is sort of the extension of that in many ways, in that it is that time where you are cut off from everything in the dunya, cut off from your family, cut off from your friends, cut off from all the benefits and enjoyment that you may have had here in death and in the qabr. So let's bring this all together, just because we're running out of time. How can you do both? How can you gain the benefits of being among people, but at the same time gain the benefits of isolation? So we do that by being among people when there's benefit in being among them, and isolating ourselves, meaning choosing isolation when there's benefit in isolation. Be careful. Sometimes we will do one or the other, not because there's benefit, but because that's what we want to do. You're by yourself. I don't like being by myself. I like being with people. Let me go to a party. If the party's halal, no problem, fine. But there may be things that are not fine, but you don't like being alone. I don't like being alone. This person's available. He may be a bad influence on me, but I'm going to go spend time with him. Or the opposite. I like being alone, so I'm not going to meet good people. I like being alone, so I'm not going to come out to that halaqah. I like being alone, so I'm not going to learn and connect myself to a teacher, and so on. But rather, a person puts their feelings to the side and instead looks for where there's benefit for their Islam. So if there's benefit in being among people, attending the salah, the jama'ah for the men, attending halaqat for men and women, where there's ibadah that is easier to do, then do it. If there's benefit in being alone, protecting yourself from harm, protecting yourself from attacks to your iman, or situations which may be harmful, then choose that in those situations. Or when you are among people, your heart should be in isolation. Right? We understand that concept? That be among people, I'm not saying like be like a zombie or like brain dead when you're with them. Like they're like, hello, like are you really there? Not like that. You're there. You're smiling, you're talking, but where's your heart at? Your heart's in that isolation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instead. So now what happens when a person's like that? When a person has that sort of mentality, then they will be among people because they're trying to fulfill something, or they're trying to gain some benefit. Allah has commanded me to be good with my family. I will go and I'll spend time with my family. But my heart is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm doing this because there's benefit and because I'm fulfilling my command. Allah has told me to be good with the believers, so I will go be good with the believers. But my heart is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, being very mindful here. I'll mention this again. Being very mindful of this idea that you not do what your feelings tell you. It's very easy for people to fall into a depression. They're in isolation, and they convince themselves, I'm very pious. I'm very pious. I stay away from all of the haram. I'm by myself and I do the dhikr of Allah all day. But the fact is, that's not why you're doing it. You just don't like people. Or you're in a state right now where you don't want to be around people. So you're not doing it for the sake of Allah, you're doing it for yourself. You have a feeling that you're trying to fulfill. That's not for Allah anymore. So be mindful of the reasons for why you're really doing it. And if you're doing it for the reasons, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will at times find yourselves among people when you don't want to be. And at times you'll find yourselves alone when you don't want to be. But rather you're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Any questions?
you mentioned about like how I guess when it comes to dawah you should know yourself and know your knowledge, but I guess with that, so say for example like you're with your group of friends and eventually every now and then you'll notice that they start doing stuff they shouldn't do, like they start backbiting other people, they start showing off things like that. So I guess my question is, do you also have to like assess your knowledge before you decide whether to steer them away from that wrong or just leave entirely?
So when you're with people, and so you're not talking about whether or not you're doing something wrong, you're talking about whether they're doing something wrong, right?
Yeah.
That's always something to be careful about as well. Again, there's the fiqhi aspect of al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahyu anil munkar, of commanding the good and forbidding the evil, which we have a responsibility towards. But this whole class, like in some other setting, if we were in the fiqh year of this, I wouldn't mention this. But because this class is about purifying yourself, even when you're commanding the good, you need to have an eye on your own heart. Why am I doing it? Am I commanding the good because I think I'm better than this person? Am I commanding the good because I dislike this person? Or do I truly consider myself to be worse than this individual, but I want to save them from the harm that they're causing themselves? So I'm just mentioning that as like something to keep in the back of your mind, that before you do try to correct someone, take a split second, assess yourself, am I doing it for the right reason? And if not, correct the reason, make it proper, and then give advice to that person. And there's no problem in doing that. But just be careful of that particular aspect. Okay.
So this is like slightly tangential, but you mentioned that Dawud Da'i and Ibn Riyad were on the isolationist side, right? So did Abu Hanifa ever comment on that then? Like, there were students saying that?
I mean, if you like read about Imam Abu Hanifa's circle, right? How did he treat them? Right? These are people in the circle who are experts in nahu, in hadith, in tafsir, in fiqh themselves, right? So the circle itself is, yes, Imam Abu Hanifa was the sort of the teacher and the head, but the circle itself is not of like beginners, right? These are mujtahideen among them as well. So the point I'm getting at is that Imam Abu Hanifa is not like to this circle, he's not some sort of like overarching, I will micromanage everything that you do and say and your preferences. But oftentimes we see that Imam Abu Hanifa would let them sort of argue. And he himself would argue, right? How many stories are there of him but discussing with Imam Abu Yusuf, back and forth until they get to an idea, get to a conclusion. So likewise, for these particular situations, as far as the preference of one or the other, Wallahu alam if it was even discussed. I don't remember coming across this particular discussion among them. But even if it were, it's a matter of preference, and it's not that. I don't see Imam Hanifa micromanaging that kind of aspect to it. Any questions from the sisters? Okay, anyone else?
So I understand the idea of choosing to isolate yourself versus being among other people for like your own benefit, but what about like the benefit of someone else? Like, if you go to a gathering, you might like hurt yourself individually, but you might have a good influence on someone else that is there.
Yeah, this comes back to that idea about you cannot benefit people if your iman itself is not strong. There are many subtle ways in which the shaitan will corrupt you, and that corruption spreads among people. You'll oftentimes see that there are people, and we see this among teachers especially, who may have a few students but have a tremendous impact. And then we see speakers who may speak to millions of people but have relatively little impact. Why? This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepting their efforts. And so efforts are more likely to be accepted when a person's iman in connection with Allah is strong. And so you'll see sometimes people, and I don't know how often, you may not have this discussion often, but myself being sort of like in that circle of serious students of knowledge, is that we oftentimes have this discussion that a person may do so much work and so much effort and say nothing's happening. And in the meantime, you have a person who does very little effort and a lot takes place. I've seen students in the madrasa who were like dead last in their class. In madrasa, we would be like, yeah, this guy's not going to amount to anything. And when he finally graduates, there's so much ikhlas in his work that he has tremendous impact on people. And then you have those people that are at the top of their class, all the way throughout. Everyone's like, this man's a genius, to the point that when he graduates, one of the teachers is like, here, marry my daughter, right? You're going to be like the next Imam Ghazālī. And that person goes on to have very little impact, sometimes negative impact, because he loses his iman and he starts giving answers or responses, or he starts dealings in a way that goes against what the ulama have done, what his own teachers may have done. And so rather than having any impact, he has negative impact, despite having literally, like, I'm not making this up, literally having married the sheikh's daughter. The potential didn't manifest itself. So you have to be very careful about this idea that I'm going to benefit people at the expense of my iman. Most likely you will not. You will cause harm in doing that. Better for you to work on your iman to make it solid, so that you have a greater impact. I know we're out of time. Just one last thing and I'll stop. There's the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that on the Day of Judgment there are 3 who will be questioned first. And among those is the alim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring the alim, and the alim will say, Ya Allah, I taught for the sake of you, I taught for your sake. I learned for your sake and I taught for your sake. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, no, you taught so that people would say that you're an alim. Well, people said you're an alim. You got what you wanted. And then he will instruct the malaika to throw this person into the fire. Many ulama will fall into that, that they learn and they teach and they think, I'm doing the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as an alim, but in the meantime they lost their iman. And they didn't do it for the sake of Allah, but they did it for their own sake. Everyone said, MashaAllah, what a great scholar, what a great da'i, what a great qari, what a great, etc., etc. On the Day of Judgment, that person will find that he had lost his iman in his work, and his reality will be shown on the Day of Judgment. We don't want to be those people. Better to have no one know you your entire life, but to die with strong iman, than to die as one of those people that the whole world knew you, but they will again know you on the Day of Judgment as the guy that Allah exposes as the one who did it for the sake of being called an alim, and everyone called him, and in front of all of those same people, you will go to the fire. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from that. Alright, inshallah we'll stop here. Jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.